I think the way to look at this in Michigan is that Michigan's always been a state that's been very generous. We've been, I think, noted for major foundations that were established early on. Ford Foundation, Mott Foundation, Kresge Foundation, some of the leading citizens. But the Kellogg Foundation was perhaps the one that I had the earliest awareness of and contact with, because they were always doing things that focused on some of the rural areas, and I grew up in rural Michigan, and so I even saw my father benefiting from a Kellogg Farmers program way back when. And Kellogg, throughout much of its history, was very focused on developing leadership. They had a lot of leadership programs for rural leaders, later on for urban leaders, for youth, and as I got active in the political world, a great friend, Russ Mawby, became the head of the Kellogg Foundation. And so here's this man who at one time was the leader of all the 4-H programs in Michigan, now running this critically important foundation. And he was inspirational. Then George Romney, literally after he completed a successful 3 terms elected as governor, and then served in the cabinet here in Washington as Secretary of HOUD, came back and devoted his entire life to giving back. And he was always an advocate for the power of what people could do when they were empowered, and how communities had to come together to help. Certainly that had, I think, some to do with his Mormon faith and the way he was raised and the way he lived his life. But I think it also had to do with just who he was and the ethic that he had inside himself. And he never stopped giving back, and he was highly inspirational. And I think the realization that he, as a business leader and then as a governor, no matter how effective the programs were, how hard he worked, there were still some things that couldn't be solved by governmental institutions. And he'd seen, not only in his church, but in the communities where people acting to solve their own problems actually could and were oftentimes more effective. And so he wanted to build that kind of a network everywhere, and that was sort of the George Romney, who functioned sort of as the Johnny Appleseed, spreading these seeds of volunteerism and community engagement all over, not just Michigan, but all over the country. But primarily in Michigan is where he really had an impact, because he lived there and he knew so many of us.
Well, one of the first meetings I had as officially as First Lady was with Governor Romney, because he was so passionate about volunteerism, and we had talked about setting up a commission to help volunteers, and he introduced me to the volunteer centers of Michigan and to the whole concept of volunteerism and how it goes hand in hand with philanthropy. And he really gave us the idea of supporting the volunteer centers rather than taking on a specific issue like a breast cancer or to take on the responsibility of helping these volunteer centers to develop the leadership and the volunteers there and their programs, because they were already doing so many great things in their communities. And each community could decide what they needed in that community, and we could provide the sort of support from whether it was the public sector or leadership development or some other kind of support for these volunteer networks that were already out there in Michigan and very strong and vibrant in Michigan.
Well, I think when Michelle really decided this was something she wanted to take on, and we thought about who are some of the best people in the state that could be around the table, who do you need to really bring forth the best ideas and inspire and motivate and challenge people, you quickly get to a Dottie Johnson, a Russ Mawby, and so on. That list was extensive in Michigan, and this was something that had nothing to do with politics. It wasn't a Republican or Democrat or independent kind of activity. It didn't have a label on it. It was just, how do you do good? How do you leverage doing good to benefit the most people, to impact the significant number of problems and challenges? And I thought there was a huge benefit from just seeing groups and attempts to solve problems literally being done on a shoestring. You look at sometimes the government budget, it'd be a program targeted at the same challenge, and they're spending a lot of money, and year after year, the problem seems to not get better, sometimes get worse, and here's a group of volunteers over there, and gosh, they're starting to turn things around in their area, and they're finding creative and innovative ways to do things, and they're also doing things in a way that actually could be replicated. So there was a whole lot of both, I think, bringing some of the right people together, and then, as Michelle said, touching on these locally based solutions that were out there, and there are a lot of other things start to come together, but that's how it gets started, I think, and from there, we ended up with I think a pretty substantial program, and we'll talk about it, but I mean, eventually even a foundation that had an endowment.
I think it was kind of a perfect storm of leadership in the state at that time, with the Russ Mobbies and the Dottie Johnsons and the Joe Loros and Rob Collier, Sam Singh, young people as well, but they all were leaders in volunteerism and philanthropy in the state. So it was kind of a wonderful time to be in that area, and they provided so much leadership there, and were so willing to be selfless about creating a structure, if you will, that would bring together all these folks and not have to take credit for one foundation or one group or another. They all wanted to work together to promote volunteerism and philanthropy in the state of Michigan, and it was a wonderful time to work with some really icons in the field of volunteerism and philanthropy in Michigan.
I think that's a really good point. One of the things that's important is that it wasn't about a particular foundation, a specific program. I mean, we've seen a lot of foundations waste a lot of money. I mean, they've done things and funded things that aren't replicable. You couldn't in a million years hope to duplicate some scheme that a foundation cooked up or somebody talked them into. But here with the Community Service Foundation, you're really leveraging people. You've got the actual citizens on the ground who know what's happening in their community, and so they're looking at it from a completely different way than somebody who might have some wonderful degrees from a fine school who are perfectly prepared to tell you how you should solve your problem. And George Romney always felt that ought to come from the bottom up. The other thing that happened during this period of time, and I think it had a lot to do with the kind of person Russ Mobby was, the kind of leader he was, but also I suspect somewhat his participation, which he was generous with his time on this commission, because the Kellogg Foundation comes forward with this grant strategy where they say, well, why don't we have a community foundation in every community in Michigan? You had long-standing community foundations in places like Detroit, but that wasn't the case in the eastern part of the Lower Peninsula or parts of the Upper Peninsula. And all of a sudden, Kellogg is saying, if you'll raise so much at a local level, we'll match that. Oh, and by the way, there's even this unique thing about getting young people involved on the grant making, if you will, getting sort of that next generation of philanthropy imbued in a few of these young rising leaders in these communities at the high school age, of all places, And so they started to do all that. Next thing you know, here's the state of Michigan, 83 counties, every inch of the state is covered by a community foundation today. And it always is amazing and impressive to me to this day. You'll see somebody, and this could be somebody of prominence or somebody who's just an active person in the local community, and you'll see that maybe there's an obituary notice, and what do they want? They want the grant, any support, no, in lieu of flowers, give the money to the community foundation. And it shows you how these have taken hold all over the state, and they're continuing to do some really impressive things, and the money stays local. Well, I think it was the idea that, and Michelle's talked about this because this was really her vision as well. I mean, so we wanted something that was not part of the political process, just something that could be a vehicle to get people involved. If you go back to '91 when this was happening, of course the state was coming out of a budget crisis. We didn't have we had no extra money. We had a lot of red ink, as a matter of fact, in those early days. But we still, even with that, places like Michigan, there's still a lot of wealth there. There's still a lot of capacity. But you've got to be careful, and you've got to manage that well, and so to create a mechanism. And I always said that the greatest strength of Michigan was the people. That the citizens who live there had a certain toughness and resilience that if you gave them a chance, you gave them the opportunity, they'd show you what they could do. And I think that's true, whether that's in terms of getting the economy moving or in terms of solving community problems. And so this was that vehicle, and it began to knit together a lot of disparate efforts that were going on. And as Michelle said, the volunteer centers, I mean, they were out there, but they didn't, they were doing the best they could with what they had. But suddenly there's now a way to hear that this group is doing this. This was a good idea. Maybe that'll work in our area. Replicating success, sharing success stories. Those are the kinds of things that you get kind of excited about. You see that people are learning from each other, and more importantly, maybe they're inspiring others to get involved, and it grows over time. And I think that the leadership you had on the commission, you mentioned some of the names, but they're pretty spectacular.
They really are. And it was a means of creating a public-private partnership, really, with to bring some of the resources of government to apply to help some of these volunteer centers that were struggling on their own out there, to connect them maybe with some Department of Social Services resources that they might not be aware of, to connect them with other government agencies that may or may not be doing some of the same sorts of programs and that may or may not be effective. So it was a way of really creating some public-private partnerships at a time when government was struggling with the budget, but also, even had it not been, government is not always the best and most effective answer. It often is, people on the ground just pitching in to help.
I think we also had a philosophy too that we weren't afraid to have faith-based organizations involved. We weren't afraid to have different kinds of communities who maybe hadn't been in the mainstream involved or hadn't been central to solving problems. So it became a bit of a melting pot of of different kinds of interests and communities and geographies. So it was really interesting that way. The other element that I thought over time, as we had a tax credit in Michigan that would allow anybody to make a contribution, and this was this functioned really as it's better than a tax credit because it was really a deduction, so you got it right off your taxes if you gave, and so it was an encouragement for everybody to give to their community foundation, and it was almost a free gift. I mean, it really was a reduction in the state's tax revenues in order to have that money go to those community foundations. At the same time, then they got to spend that money, and I guess if we look back at it, we'd probably conclude they spent it a lot better sometimes than the legislature appropriated it.
It was not a political organization, the commission. I remember asking a couple of people, begging even, to be a part of it, and them being quite concerned that this not be, sort of an arm of the Republican governor. He felt very strongly, as I did, that this would be a very bipartisan, nonpartisan commission, and I think we managed to make it so, and in fact, succeeding governors kept the commission on, and that I think was a very important part of it, that it was not seen as a partisan arm of the Republican governor.
Well, we were trying to explain to people that conservatism really meant the preservation and the husbanding of resources. It meant stop spending money wastefully, and so we were always happy to have programs working where they could be more effective than the program they were replacing, or where frankly there was a gap in service and nobody was taking care of the need. I think there's a fundamental philosophical difference. I think certainly people who come at government from a more conservative perspective ought to be looking at the idea that the distinction is this. Do you think government is going to be more compassionate and more creative in solving your problem than you could be if you had the tools to do so? And I think that's been answered, unfortunately, pretty clearly over a long period of time, a sweep of history. I think that what we tried to do was to create just a a robust mechanism that was out there, and I'm happy that it's continued to this day. I'm very proud of the leadership that Michigan has provided to the nation, and ultimately, other things happened. The leadership of Dottie and Randy Reeker and others, and the Council of Michigan Foundations really was a national model also, where suddenly you started, bringing together lots of different people. And I think this today in America, we have a lot of people who are looking at setting up family foundations, have already done that. There's a lot of giving back, and I spent a lot of years on the Annie E. Casey Foundation board, so I've had some experience with that foundation world as well. But it just seems to me that if we could get everybody, kind of thinking about how do we get some of these problems that have been with us for so long finally turned around, boy, we could make some strides. It's exciting to me, and I think too often if people want to stand back and say, well, let somebody else, meaning really the government, do it, we're just going to wait a long time for answers, and frankly, I don't think we've got that much time. Well, Michelle really ought to start that conversation, because that actually was not my idea. That came from the commission. You guys at the commission brought that to me, and we did it at a time when we could literally afford to do it, and recognize that this might be the perfect time to do it, because putting it in place would allow it to endure.
Yeah, and I think we approached John in the legislature with the idea that if we set this endowment, that this will be, funded in perpetuity. Volunteerism and the volunteerism efforts that have abounded throughout Michigan. So we approached and asked for $10 million with the idea that we will raise the matching funds, and so that it would be a total of $20 million. And John was amenable to that. He said, you better get it matched. And we worked quite a bit on visiting with corporations and foundations and individuals to match that. And we're very proud of that accomplishment.
And I don't know if that remains today the only endowed effort of its time, but I think it is, and that's pretty impressive. And it did reflect, I think, a commitment. And legislature, there were some key people in legislature who get a lot of credit for it. Too many to name all at once here, but we didn't do it alone. And then, as Michelle said, there were foundations and companies that really stepped up and secured that match, and so that then protected that fund no matter what happens, because they, after I was gone from Michigan, after Michelle was no longer chair of the commission, they went through some pretty tough budget times out there, but that was not touchable. The Kellogg Foundation, under the kind of leadership of Russ Mawby, provided, and of course Dottie Johnson was on the board, then Dottie herself was very active with her own foundation, and there were, you've got the West Michigan Philanthropy example for a whole community that literally has been vaulted to the top among mid-sized cities in the country because of private philanthropy. That Michigan's got a lot of good lessons for people to take a look at. And the other thing that's happened is that the Michigan leadership, I'm very proud of the people who played a role in Michigan who've gone on to play national roles. And so there's a national prominence to folks in Michigan who come up with this kind of background. And so in some ways, there is a bit of a philanthropy industry, if you will, but it's been something that if we look ahead at our country and where we're headed, there's going to be a lot of opportunities for people in this space. And I think that it would behoove them to take a look at how Michigan handles some of these things and say, boy, that's a good model, because I think we've seen a number of these efforts really keep the overhead down, and the maximum of the benefit then gets out to the solution, or to work on the solution you're trying to bring to reality. And that's a contrast to those who end up with, let's just say, maybe overbuilt headquarters and overstaffed organizations, and by the time you're done, the program officers are representing a bigger bureaucracy than the very government that might have seen them come into existence, and that to me is not the desirable path, and it's a good caution to kind of always remember what your objective really is.
And I think, as a newcomer to Michigan, I was very struck by the long history of volunteerism and philanthropy in Michigan. I think that's almost unique certainly to the United States, but even in Michigan, it's at a so much greater level, I think, than in other states. And I think George Romney was sort of the personification of volunteerism and spreading those seeds, as John said. And so we started with a very strong base of volunteerism and philanthropy in Michigan, and just tried to build on that history and make better organizations.
Well, I think that they've had a good example in their mom, for sure. They've also been part of lots of things. We had our daughter Madeline was very involved in trying to raise money when she was in elementary school for victims of 9/11, and actually came up with and really executed a little fundraiser at a very early age. They've continued to be involved. We were just recently at an event. Now the girls are in college. Our daughter Hannah was involved with the Take Back the Night event at Ann Arbor, where working against sexual violence. So they're doing things that matter. Our other daughter Maggie was home on spring break recently, and she was working on a curriculum for girls that are going to come to her campus and learn how to code and to get active in technology and to do the part she was working on specifically was cybersecurity, for kids still in this particularly it was young women still in high school. So there's I think it's just part of who they are, probably because they've had some examples, I think, along the way. I hope that's what that's come from. But I do think that most people want to, when given an opportunity, are happy to help. I think that's, and I do think also part of the religious heritage of this country is good, and that would be a shame. A lot of studies today say there's some decline there, but there needs to be, I think, some values and some belief systems that are they're greater than just you yourself, and what you can get for you, and so I don't think we'll have the kind of country or the kind of communities we'd like unless we have people who care. And I think that when you look at people, it's always interesting how often I've seen that the most effective employees are themselves not only effective here, but they're effective as moms or dads or people
Volunteers.
back in their they're volunteers. They're doing things back home, for not just for their kids, but for their larger community. And that's pretty cool. They could be doing a fundraiser at school, working with the scouts, working with whatever the organization is, and that kind of giving back makes a big difference.
We have talked often about to whom much is given, much is expected. And so as John talked about, one has tutored, one was in high school, she was head of the diversity group, and there was service learning in their school. And two of our daughters' schools had the service learning programs, so they were both very involved in those projects, and then in leading up the projects as seniors among freshmen. So they understand their requirements. They understand what it takes to be a good citizen of this country and of this world, really, and that is giving back in whatever way you can.